Welcome back to this channel. It's resident internet psychic medium and spiritual advisor, Mystic Rainn, and today we're going to be talking about ego and the role it plays in spirituality. So we have a question that came in from that girl 29864. What are your thoughts on the ego in regards to humility? I agree with anti-humility, but I've heard it said a lot in the spiritual community that people need to let go of their ego to get in touch with their higher self. But having an ego should be a good thing, right? Unless the term ego is used differently in a spiritual context. It's confusing me. I would love your insight on this topic. So when it comes to the anti-humility, I did make a video on my opinion and my take in terms of humility. And so I will link that below if anyone is interested in sort of going back to that video to see kind of what's prompting this question. But no, you are right, that girl 29864. A lot of people do say that you are supposed to let go of your ego to get in touch with yourself. I think that the reason why that's said, I think there's a split. I think there is like half the spiritual community who is saying that, who's believing that you actually you actually have to set it, like let it go, like get rid of it and let it go in order to come into your higher self. By the way, if that is what they believe, I don't have an issue with that, right? But then I also think that there's another half of the spiritual community that is probably picking the wrong words for what they're actually trying to say. My take on this in terms of how I've always practiced the relationship with the ego is understanding when to tell your ego to go have several seats. It's impossible to let your ego go. If you were to let your ego go, you would die, right? Because your ego was what is keeping you alive. But the issue with the ego is that when it's not tamed, when it's not in balance, when you're not working with it, when you don't understand your shadow self, when it's still highly reactive instead of responsive, your ego gets in the way. Your ego is very loud. And so I think this is where this comes from the idea of like letting it go in order to come into your higher self, because when you're not properly integrated with the ego has a tendency to talk so loud that you can't actually hear your higher guidance. You can't actually hear your higher self or find your higher self because your ego is in the way. Really, what you're trying to do is learn how to discern between when your ego is present and when it's not. And if it is present, being able to understand whether or not you're currently in a situation where your ego should be present or when it should be able to go sit down somewhere. And if you are in a situation where it should be able to go sit down somewhere, then knowing how to tell your ego to actually sit down. It's not so much about letting it go in terms of it like disappearing or that it's leaving you. It is understanding when your ego has a space to talk and like when it doesn't. And so the reason for this is because your ego is your shadow side. It's your shadow self. Your ego is, when not balanced, when unhealed, your ego is all of the pieces of you that you have yet to come to terms with. It is all the things in you that you are embarrassed by, that you are ashamed of, that you are guilty of. Your ego is all of your unresolved trauma. Your ego is that hurt inner child. All of that is what creates the ego. All of that is what's creating the shadow self. So for those of you that don't know, when someone is saying shadow and when they're saying ego, a lot of times they're using those words interchangeably. Your ego is your shadow self and your shadow self is your ego self. Everyone has a shadow, right? It's like a light, and then the shadow or the ego is the dark side of you. Now, the dark side of you does not mean like dark entity or evil energy. It just means it's the side of you that you probably don't like seeing the light very often, simply because it is unresolved. Because it's unresolved, and because most people don't necessarily have a working relationship with that side of themselves, the ego has a tendency to be very reactive. The ego has a tendency to yell, to throw tantrums, to get angry, to be emotionally unmanaged. And when you have that side of you being the one making all of your decisions, then that is when you start to get yourself in trouble. A lot of people have their ego making all of their decisions. A lot of people are not making a lot of their decisions from their higher self or with their higher guidance. They're making it with their ego. And that is why sometimes you end up in a situation where you go, oh, I shouldn't have done that. Like if you were ever in a situation where you feel like you shouldn't have done a certain thing or you shouldn't have said a certain thing, then you were not following your higher guidance. What you were doing was letting your ego sort of lead. And the problem with having your ego lead when it's not managed and it's not balanced is that your ego is always going to be in a state of reacting instead of responding, right? It's highly reactive. The ego is typically really angry because it's all of our unresolved issues. It's our unresolved stuff. And because of that, it's angry, and the anger is self-righteous. Not that there's a problem with it. It's just there to protect you. Your ego is also your survival mechanism. Your ego is your instinct. Your ego is your reptilian part of the brain. All things that are not helpful when you're trying to tap into your higher self and listen to your higher guidance. And the reason for that is because instinct responds. Instinct does not consider and then deliberate and then slowly but surely come up with a plan. Your instinct is designed to respond, right? And that is to keep you alive. You got to think back during cave days. If you were sleeping in a cave and then you heard a rustle, right, in the trees outside of the cave in the middle of the night, what you should not be doing is sitting there going, let's think about this. I want to know what this is. That's not because by the time you finish thinking about it, you're probably dead. You probably got eaten, right? The ego is what kicks in. That fight or flight mode, the adrenaline, that's the ego. That's kicking in, and it's kicking in to keep you alive. And so in situations like that, it's reacting. It's not responding. It's not stopping to think about maybe the fact the wind blew and that's the noise that you're hearing. It's thinking predator, right? We got to get out of here. And so the ego has not devolved since us stopped living in caves. It's still doing what it's supposed to be doing. It is a very hyper vigilant mechanism in the body, right? The difference between the ego now and then, though, is that then the ego had a role, it had a job, and it was used often. Whereas now you have people who probably live in some form of shelter, like a home or an apartment, right? You're not necessarily looking out for lions and tigers and bears. And so the part of you that is designed to protect, the part of you that is designed to exercise strength in order to overpower and overtake, right? Because you got to hunt in order to eat. The parts of you that's designed to do that no longer really have a role. And so right now it's very hyper vigilant in other areas of life. And so that comes out when people go, did that person look at me funny? Did that person say something with a weird tone? Like all of those things is the ego now trying to find a job for itself to do because it's still instinct. You can't help that the ego is reactionary because it's instinct. That is what it's designed to do. And your ego will remember all of the things that got you in the past, all of the things that it failed to protect you from, all of the dangers that it failed to protect you from are now going to be things that it's going to remember. And so every time your ego recognizes a pattern that is reminiscent of something that happened to you previously that wasn't that great, your ego is now going to step in and react, right? Now, in regards to like spirituality, what your ego doesn't have an ability to do is determine between like actual threats and false threats. To the ego, everything is a threat because it's designed to protect you. It's designed to keep you alive. Your ego is your instinct, right? And like I always say, we people forget, but we are animals. We are primates. We have instinct, right? And that is what that ego is. This is how people have an ability to get angry and black out and they see red because you're in your animal. right? You're operating purely on instinct. It's the reptilian part of your brain that has kicked in, and those are the hormones that are flooding. You are no longer operating with sense, right? And so if you have that part of you being the thing that's constantly responding to every single situation, then you will lack an ability to pull on the information that's coming out of your higher guidance. Now, the trick, in my opinion, is not to let the ego go. There's no way of letting it go. One, you need it in this world because it protects you. It's the thing that keeps you hyper vigilant. It's your ego is with the hairs that stand up in the back of your neck to tell you that you need to leave a situation. You need that ego. Also, the ego will not leave quietly, right? Because it's going to go, but I'm here to protect you. How dare you reject me? And because the ego is also that inner child that is holding all that unresolved trauma, the only thing you're going to get by letting it go is a fit. It's going to be really angry. It's not going to actually want to leave. And a reason for that is because it is a part of you. What you really want is the integration of both the sort of higher side of you and the ego side of you. And when you integrate, that makes it balanced. And then once you become balanced with your ego, then you have an ability to instruct it, to tell it what to do, to tell it when it is okay and not okay to react and to be reactionary, when it is and is not okay to show up. And if there are times when it is reacting and it's reacting without you giving permission or approval or to say so that it's okay, because it's imbalanced, you have some level of control over it where you can say, okay, it's all right, you're reacting, but I need you to calm down now. That's the self of us when we feel ourselves getting frustrated with people and we have an ability to say, you know what, just give me 5 minutes. I feel that I'm going a little bit too far and I need a minute to calm down. That is you controlling the ego. And a lot of people don't actually have the ability to do that. How do you control the ego? You control the ego by first listening to it and understanding it, because the ego is still you. And so you have to do shadow work. And shadow work is working with all the shadow pieces of yourself that you have previously rejected or hidden or buried or put away because it hurt too much. It is all of the unresolved trauma. It is all those childhood moments that didn't go the way you hoped that they would go. It is the abuse that you suffered. It is even as an adult, maybe a really embarrassing moment, a time when you were humiliated, a time when you were embarrassed, things that you are ashamed of. All of the darker aspects of self is what is the shadow, is what is the ego. And you have to start learning how to resolve those aspects of yourself. And through this resolution, then you have an ability to tell your ego to go sit down somewhere. But through the resolution, you also have an ability to then let go of the hurt and the pain that you were previously carrying. It's not really about letting it go of the ego itself. It's more so about letting go of the stuff that your ego was holding, the pain, the trauma, all of that stuff that the ego is holding is letting it go. But the way you do that is through shadow work. You have to go back and revisit all of those things in you that you don't really like that much. The thing about you that you are ashamed of, you have to go confront it, look at it, figure out where it came from, why you're ashamed of it, and what is it about that thing that you don't want to reach the light. And when it comes to reaching the light, that you don't want to be public, or you don't want people to know about, because all of the things in the shadow tend to be things that are repressed. And they are things that you don't really want to talk to people about, right? So what is it about that thing that makes you ashamed that you don't really want to discuss? The trauma that you experienced in your childhood. What are those things? Go back to your inner child, to that self, whatever that trauma point was when you were 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, that kicked it all off, that began that journey of who you are today. What happened? Go back to that little you and validate that experience for little you. Because a lot of the stuff that's sitting in the ego is stuff that makes us angry. But a lot of that stuff is also caused by other people or triggered by other people. And what we have to realize at a certain point in the journey is that those other people are not coming back. They're not coming back to apologize. Either they don't know they hurt your feelings or they're dead. Okay. And if they're not dead, then they just don't care. And that's the truth. And so what we have to do when we reach a certain point in our journey is take accountability for our own healing. And it's your job through the use of shadow work that you go back into your little you and you start validating all of the things that happened to you, because it's still there for whatever reason, because at some point in time it was dismissed. So you have to go back and evaluate it. You have to then validate it. And then you have to make a decision to move forward. And moving forward may mean letting it go. Now, letting it go does not mean forgiving the person, because if you're not in that space to do so, then you're not in that space to do so. It does not mean that you forget what happened to you, because why should you? It shaped who you are, right? But it may mean that in order to reach a feeling of lightness where you can release some of the burden, some of the weight that you're holding, it may mean that you let it go, right? But this process is a healing process. And what happens when you start to heal the ego starts to get calmer and calmer and calmer. And so the example I like to use a lot is when you're think about think about like a teenager. And I'm talking like coming into teens, 12, 13, 14 years old, when kids are like the most amounts of insufferable, right? And they are moody and they are angsty. And this is a time when they feel like nobody understands them and the world will never get them. And they are out here conquering life alone, right? Go back to like that time and think about how they feel when they feel dismissed, unheard ever. Like for those of you that maybe remember that time when you were that age, or maybe you have kids that are that age, when you may have felt dismissed, that feeling of that happens in like a teenager, right? And if it carries on enough, they start to throw tantrums, they start to fight back, to yell back, to talk back. That is the ego. And what we don't oftentimes realize is that when you are encountering adults in the world, what you're really getting is that inner teenager. The amount of adults that are out here still throwing tantrums. I watch people stomp their feet. I have seen grown adults stomp their feet in a huff, right? Because that is the ego. It's unresolved. And so if you are dealing with adults throwing tantrums, which I'm sure you guys probably see regularly at work and any job, doesn't matter what you do for a living, right? And you see someone throwing a tantrum, what you are witnessing is that person's ego playing out and about. Hello, for everybody to see. Mostly because when they threw the tantrum when they were younger, no one probably paid them any attention. And so now they're an adult and they're continuously throwing tantrums. However, how much money would you want to bet that if you recorded that tantrum and the foot stomping, and then at a later time when that person has calmed down and you showed them how they actually are behaving, they probably would say, I guess I probably shouldn't have done that, or I could have done something else, or the way I communicated that could have been better. It's because they are understanding through their higher self that they were reacting, that their ego was out at large to play, and that the ego in that moment was calling all of the shots. And the reason why they're still throwing tantrums in their adulthood is because the hurt, the pain, the embarrassment, the trauma, whatever, has never been resolved. So they're still carrying it and it's coming out. That's why you can have an interaction with someone and they can be absolutely miserable. And you're thinking to yourself, who hurt you? And that's a legitimate question, because the person that hurt them, that is now creating a situation where they're now going around being insensitive, being unkind, hurting other people. That situation was never actually resolved because it lives in the shadow self. It lives in the ego. When you can start resolving your shadow self, you can start this process of integrating, which is blending your light and your dark side back together. You cannot get rid of your shadow self. Your shadow self is the flavor of who you are, because your shadow self is created of all of those unique experiences that have shaped you. But again, and I will always say this, you are still an animal, right? Your shadow self is your instinct. Your ego is your instinct, and you need it. You need it to survive. But you want it to be in a state of balance. That way, when you are coming across a certain situation, whatever it is in life, and you feel your shadow self start to pop out, react, that you have enough integration with it through the understanding of your ego that you can just simply tell it to go sit down, right? And that is when you are in a situation that you may find triggering, that you may find provoking, and you have an ability to say, like I mentioned before, actually, I'm starting to feel really triggered right now. That is you having an ability to identify your ego and your shadow. My ego feels really triggered right now. I feel my ego starting to get angry right now. And in order for us to have a productive conversation and maintain a productive relationship with each other, I may need to step away. And that is you telling your ego to go take a step to the side. And typically what happens is people will then go, I'm going to breathe. Let me have some deep breaths, right? And then they breathe, they think, and then that information that then comes through about what the next step is now coming from the higher self. The ego is loud and it is distracting and it wants to be heard all of the time. And so you want to get to a point where you can kind of push it to the side a little bit so you can actually hear what's going on in your higher guidance, because your higher guidance will tell you, look, that person is not worth it. That person actually is just really suffering right now. That person is really miserable. And so because they're miserable, they're spreading their energy everywhere because misery loves company. Your higher self will actually walk you through whatever it is that you're going through, but you can't hear your higher self if you are playing with the ego, right? And then in terms of, because some people may go, well, how does that relate to things like, psychic ability and things like that? It's the same thing. Your psychic ability, if that is something that you're pursuing, or even if you are, I don't know, working with like tarot cards or something and you're waiting for guidance to come through, that is coming from your higher self, right? And your higher self, and that guidance is calm, it's peaceful. It has a peaceful or calm voice or a peaceful or calm feeling. It's not going to yell. And for a lot of people, that guidance doesn't repeat itself. It kind of says its thing once. It's sort of like an I said what I said kind of thing. And then it just kind of waits for you to get the message, right? Whereas the ego will repeat it. And then it just won't shut up. Your higher self will just very calmly, but very self-assuredly just sort of say it once. And when you are working within your psychic ability, you need to have quiet in order to hear, right? What's coming through, in order to receive the message of what's coming through, in order to separate it. Because your ego is that part of you that likes to fill in the blanks. And so if you are picking up on a message and you have no context, because that is what happens when you pick up on messages. You have no context. You have no real reason for why you're getting the message. You don't really know what it pertains to. You may know that it has to go to a particular person, but you don't really know why you're saying it, right? And if you are receiving those messages, your ego will start to talk. It'll start trying, girl, I know what that's about. And then it'll start plugging in the blanks. And the problem is it's oftentimes wrong because your ego is rarely right. Your ego is just loud, right? When it comes to things that are intellectual, your ego is just loud. Your ego is only right when it comes to instinct, when it comes to getting you out of a place at the right time, right? When it comes to keeping you alive, making sure or maintaining, what is it? What word was I trying to say? Mortality? Is that the right way to go about that? I don't remember. But when it comes to maintaining life and breath, then that's where your ego shines. But when it comes to anything else, in terms of like knowledge, that's not, the ego is just loud. It's not right. The knowledge is the other angel on the other shoulder, right? It's the wisdom that's coming from a higher place. And that wisdom is quiet. That's why it's called like inner knowing, right? It is quiet and it is calm and it's not going to create a ruckus. And if you've got one side of you that's always in ruckus, and for a lot of you it is, because the ego is the part of your brain that's running 24/7. It's a part of your brain that prevents you from going to sleep at night. It's a part of your brain from convincing you that Armageddon is happening tomorrow and that like you're going to get got. That's the ego. And it's very busy and it's busy all the time. And when you've got all of that happening on one side of you and you don't have an ability to tell it to sit down and then have it listen to you, right? Then it'll overrun everything that you're doing. And that is why people say you need to let it go, right? Now, do I believe it needs to be fully let go? I personally don't. I think that we live in a 3D world. I think we live in a world full of animals, and I also believe that a lot of them, including humans, are predators. And because of that, I believe that the best approach is to have a healthy relationship with your ego, meaning understanding why it behaves the way it behaves, so it can always be out. I don't actually like to tell my ego to go sit down. I like her to be out all of the time. I just like for her to know her place. And that requires an immense amount of work and getting to know and accepting and understanding self, understanding why I am who I am, why I behave the way I behave, why I respond the way I respond, why I react to certain things the way I react to them, why certain things trigger me, anger me, annoy me. All those times in my childhood that I don't really appreciate happened to me, all those times where it did happen, going back to that moment in time and giving little me a hug and validating my experience for myself, and because I understand why. And I can look at a situation before it even starts and go, oh, that shadow bitch ain't gonna like this. And I'm not gonna tell her to sit down because her job is to protect me, right? But because there's a relationship that I have with my shadow side also trusts that I will always call upon it when it's when we reach a point where we are now in that shadow's expertise, right? And so an example of that would be meeting someone for the first time. Some people would say, you don't know people, you should, some people go like, people have a hard time trusting, but you shouldn't have a hard time trusting. You don't really know everybody. People would help you, blah, 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 blah. For me, when it comes to whether or not I trust somebody, for me, that's the job for my shadow. I don't let my higher self make that decision, because my higher self is going to tell me everybody has good in there somewhere. Somewhere deep inside, if everybody's chakras were balanced, they would all be wise and calm. And then my shadow self is going to be like, bitch. And that's the part of me that I would prefer to make that decision. So what you're doing is finding the balance between the two. It's not good to let one go. It's also not good to let one talk more than the other. There should be as close to a 50-50 relationship as possible, because your higher self will always see things from the higher perspective. And the higher perspective isn't necessarily useful on this plane. It's 3D. We're on a planet of animals. We're on a planet of predators, okay? And if I sit there and I let my higher self make every single one of the decisions, y'all saw Jeffrey Dahmer in the Netflix special, okay? Like, that's not going to happen. The shadow self needs a stage. She's part of the panel. She's part of the board, right? But in order to make sure she sits on the board and she doesn't set the shit on fire, that means I have to constantly be working on my shadow aspects of myself, where I'm constantly seeing where I'm constantly seeing myself and I'm constantly understanding myself, right? Because for a lot of people, myself included, a very common trigger point for people is when they feel like they're not seen and they're not heard. That makes people angry. And your shadow self is full of all those moments in your life where you feel like you weren't seen or you weren't heard and you were being dismissed and nobody cared about what it is that you had to say. And it's that piece of you that when you fly off the handle and you're going batshit crazy, it's that piece of you, that part of you that's sitting in the shadow that's like, I'm sick of not being seen. I'm sick of not being heard. So fuck all of you. But here's the thing. You may not want to go crazy on everybody in a certain situations. Maybe like work. You may want to have to rein that in a little bit. And so the balance and the work between the two help you get an idea of when your ego and your shadow is speaking, when your higher self and higher guidance is speaking, when they are working together, right? It's an integration that's what you really want. But I do think that people use the word let it go, let the ego go when they're talking spirituality, probably more so in the beginning of the journey, because it's easier to understand that concept. When you start elaborating, like how I just have, about how there needs to be some form of integration and like how you do that, When people are new on the journey, that can actually be a very confusing thing. And so people sometimes kind of like to break it all the way apart until it's super simple, which is just letting it go completely, having them figure out how to let it go completely. And then when they're ready to reintegrate, then going, okay, let's reintroduce the shadow. Whereas my approach is never letting the shadow go. My approach is start the reintegration of the shadow immediately. To me, that should be step one, right? Because if you let it go, then it's you, once again, in my opinion, dismissing it, ignoring it, not hearing or seeing it or recognizing it for what it is, right? Which is instinct, which is the part of you that's designed to protect. And it's also the part of you that everything went to go die. All the parts of you that you don't like, you had to send them to a graveyard, and that's where you send them. It sits in the shadow. And that's why the shadow for a lot of people is very angry. That's why it's dark. That's why the darker thoughts sit in the shadow. The darker actions sit in the shadow, because it's everything that we buried that wasn't supposed to be seen or heard, or everything that other people told us needed to be buried or shouldn't be seen or heard. But I think that the best approach is integration, and through integration, that there's a lot of healing that's required to do that. But the more you heal, the easier it becomes to hear your higher guidance, to trust your higher guidance, and to execute on your higher guidance, because you know what voice in your head you're listening to. When you have not yet come to terms with the ego, you may not know what voice in your head you're listening to. And so what happens is you're like, should I trust this? Should I not? Should I trust this? Should I not? Because if I trust this, then I may do something to mess it up, and then now I can't trust it anymore. I've met a lot of people like that who had a hard time making decisions because they didn't know if the decision that they would make would be a good one, right? And what that is that person being extra cautious of that ego, of that shadow self, because they let it make a decision previously, and that decision was not a good one, right? And so now they're like extra cautious about, what am I listening to when I'm making these decisions? And so if you grow accustomed to developing a relationship with your shadow, you know what it sounds like, you know what it's doing, you know if it's reacting, you know why it's reacting. And when you know the answer to these questions, you have an ability to stop the trigger. If I'm triggered in my shadow, I can tell you why I'm triggered. And if there's a time when I can't, because I'm recognizing that my ego is going through a triggering moment, I know to go step away, to go do some quick detective work to figure out what happened, right? In order for me to get back to a place of like equilibrium. But that's what people was talking about when they're saying let it go, right? Having an ability to set it to the side, tell it to stand aside, in order to create room for your higher guidance that is flowing, in order for you to receive the message or to hear it. Because if you don't separate them at times, you will miss it. You can't hear it. Now, eventually, people do get good enough where you're no longer telling your higher self to stand to the side or to go sit down or to let it go. Eventually, people do get good enough to have both sides operating in tandem, where not one side is sitting out at any particular time. And what happens is that the two sides will naturally give way to each other, and will give way, and you'll start to notice that the messages are coming from one side or the other, and you'll be able to differentiate between that. But that's like advanced, level stuff, right? So I wouldn't worry so much about that, but that's what it is. That's what people are trying to say. So that goes back to the beginning where I said, I do think that there's like half of people who are genuinely meaning to like let it go in general, like just let go of the ego. I do think that there are people that are like that. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that practice. I think it works for people. I don't think it works for me. And the reason why I don't think it works for me is because, to be quite honest, I'm not evolved enough, right? And I quite like my ego. I quite like my shadow self. I think I have a very healthily developed ego. I like her. She's funny. And if I didn't have her, I don't think I'd be as funny, But not everyone feels that way. But that's my path that I prefer to take. And when I'm teaching it to other people, I teach it from a place of integration. But I also respect that that may not resonate with everybody, and I'm unoffended, right? But then I also do think that the other half of people mean what I'm saying. They're just maybe phrasing it wrong. And so it's confusing people. So That is my answer, my very long-winded answer. And I hope that helped. So I'm gonna leave the video here. If you like what you see, subscribe to this channel. And if we don't meet again, I'll see you next lifetime.